As the Third Reich began to collapse, the world was forced to confront the devastation and the lessons left behind by an unprecedented war. Nazi war criminals were arrested, charged, and brought to justice for the horrors and atrocities they had committed. But amid this pursuit of justice, a disturbing question emerged. What should be done with the young people who had embraced Nazism? Many of these youths had been absorbed into Hitler's ideological and military machinery from early childhood. They were part of the Hitler Youth, an organization designed to indoctrinate and militarize Germany's youth. Some of them grew up to become soldiers, officers, and in extreme cases, perpetrators of heinous crimes. For these young people, the end of the war did not mean peace. It marked the beginning of an even darker reality. Welcome to Wartime Archive. The rise of the Hitler Youth and the manipulation of a generation.
Hitler gets a tremendous ovation when leaving for his first cabinet meeting.
When Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party rose to power in the early 1930s, one of their top priorities was to secure ideological control over future generations. To achieve this, they focused on creating a youth that embodied the principles of the so-called superior Aryan race and was willing to defend the vision of the Third Reich. This goal materialized through the creation of the Hitler Youth, or Hitlerjugend in German, a fundamental pillar in Nazi indoctrination. The Hitler Youth did not appear out of nowhere. Nationalist and militaristic youth organizations already existed in Germany. However, it was the Nazi regime that took this concept and turned it into an unprecedented tool of propaganda and control. In the early 1920s, the movement was small and limited, but its expansion skyrocketed when Hitler was appointed Chancellor in 1933. The purpose was clear: to mold the minds of German children, transforming them into obedient citizens ready to sacrifice themselves for the Führer and his idea of the German fatherland. By 1936, Hitler made it mandatory for all children over the age of 10 to enroll in the Hitler Youth. By the end of the 1930s, millions of young boys and girls were already part of this system. Boys were subjected to a training that focused on military service, preparing them for war from an early age. Girls, on the other hand, were enrolled in the League of German Girls, Bund Deutscher Mädel, where they were taught to adopt traditional roles of motherhood and domestic support, alongside physical and mental training to serve the Nazi state. Nazi education extended far beyond the classroom. It was a comprehensive and aggressive system that encompassed all aspects of youth life. From the age of 6, children entered the German Young People's League, Deutsches Jungvolk, a subdivision of the Hitler Youth designed to distance them from any external ideological influence. Schools, rather than being centers of neutral education, were transformed into platforms for youth indoctrination. There, students were taught Aryan racial supremacy, hatred of Jews, communists, and other so-called enemies, and the belief in German superiority over the rest of the world. The training provided by the Hitler Youth had an openly warlike focus. Boys learned to handle weapons, participated in military drills, and engaged in rituals inspired by warrior traditions. Discipline was strict and brutality was part of the process. The goal was to prepare a generation of hardened youth mentally and physically fit for war and devoid of empathy or compassion for their enemies. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi leadership understood the strategic value of controlling the younger generations. Hitler repeatedly stated that the future of Nazi power depended on German youth. Through the Hitler Youth, he sought to build an ideologically loyal base, a group of indoctrinated young people trained to idealize Aryan supremacy and to carry out the orders of the Third Reich without question. The Hitler Youth in the war effort. When Germany entered the war in 1939, the Hitler Youth transitioned from being an indoctrination organization to an active military apparatus. From the outset of the conflict, the youths, trained through years of discipline and propaganda, were ready to serve in any role the regime assigned them. The idea that it was their patriotic duty to defend the homeland had been instilled in them since childhood, and that nationalist fervor led them to volunteer as communication assistants, firefighters, and factory workers supporting the war industry. As the war progressed and the Wehrmacht suffered increasing casualties, the situation became critical. In 1943, the Nazi regime began mobilizing 16 and 17-year-olds, and in the final months of the war, even children under the age of 12. These youths, poorly prepared and barely armed, were thrown into the front lines, especially during the defense of Berlin in April 1945. Armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons and blind faith in the regime, they attempted to halt the Red Army, but their lack of experience and resources made them easy targets. Many perished in desperate and senseless attacks. However, not all members of the Hitler Youth were merely victims of Nazi propaganda. Some actively participated in war crimes. Integrated into military units like the Waffen-SS, they took part in massacres and atrocities against prisoners of war and civilians. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, composed largely of youths from this organization, is a key example. During the Battle of Normandy in 1944, its members executed Canadian prisoners and committed acts of brutality that reflected the violent indoctrination they had undergone for years. These actions reveal the darkest side of the Hitler Youth, a generation shaped for war and hatred, used as a military tool in the most desperate moments of the Third Reich, the end of the war, the Allied hunt for war criminals. When World War II ended in May 1945, the Allied forces launched a crucial mission, bringing Nazi war criminals to justice. With the collapse of the Third Reich and the discovery of atrocities committed in concentration camps like Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau, the scale of genocide and mass murder was exposed to the world. The evidence was undeniable. Official documents, mass graves, and survivor testimonies confirmed a genocide planned and executed by the Nazi state. The leaders of the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France agreed to capture and prosecute the top officials responsible for these crimes through unprecedented judicial proceedings. The most well-known of these was the Nuremberg trial, held between 1945 and 1946, where prominent Nazi figures such as Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Albert Speer were charged with war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. But Nuremberg was just the beginning. As the Allies arrested the main architects of the Holocaust, a difficult question arose: what to do with the young people who had actively participated in the Nazi machinery? Most of them came from the Hitler Youth, a group ideologically shaped from childhood to serve the regime. The US military tribunals, which oversaw much of occupied Germany, were tasked with determining the responsibility of these young individuals. In the early days of the post-war period, the approach was strict. There was no room for compassion in a context where the atrocities were so evident. Those who had taken part in mass killings, run concentration camps, or used slave labor were tried swiftly and without leniency. A clear example was the case of the members of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. This formation, composed almost entirely of indoctrinated youth, was responsible for executing 53 Canadian prisoners of war during the Battle of Normandy in 1944. Although many of those involved were teenagers, their brutality was not overlooked, and US tribunals judged them by the same standards as adults, rejecting the defense that they had been manipulated by Nazi propaganda. However, as the trials progressed, a key distinction began to emerge between those youths who had joined the Nazi regime voluntarily and those who were forced to participate in its crimes under threat of reprisal, including death. Reports revealed that many acted out of fear or coercion, while others, deeply indoctrinated, committed atrocities without hesitation. This distinction sparked debates about the culpability of a generation raised in an environment of propaganda and fanaticism. The process of hunting and prosecuting Nazi war criminals was complex and morally challenging. The involvement of the Hitler Youth in the war effort and in war crimes left behind a dark legacy, serving as a lasting reminder of the dangers of ideologically manipulating younger generations. The Lesser Tribunals, justice for the Nazi regime's accomplices. While the Nuremberg trials marked a milestone in international justice, they were only the beginning of a broader effort to hold accountable those who participated in the crimes of the Third Reich. In addition to prosecuting the top Nazi leaders, the Allies, particularly the United States, led a series of lesser-known trials aimed at prosecuting lower-level individuals who had facilitated the regime's atrocities. Under the supervision of U.S. military tribunals, thousands of people, from ordinary soldiers to concentration camp administrators, doctors, and bureaucrats, were tried for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other atrocities. Justice was meant not only for those at the top, but also for those who executed the genocidal policies of Nazism. One of the most complex challenges was deciding what to do with the youths who had been active participants in the regime. Many of these teenagers, members of the Hitler Youth, had been indoctrinated since childhood, shaped by an ideology of hatred and racial supremacy. By the end of the war, thousands of them had been mobilized into military units like the Waffen-SS, taking part in horrific crimes both on the front lines and in the concentration camps. American prosecutors faced an ethical dilemma. Should these youths be treated as victims of the Nazi propaganda machine, or as criminals responsible for their actions? The answer varied from case to case. Allied Control Council Law No. 10 allowed flexibility in the trials, permitting the courts to assess each situation individually. Among the most notorious cases were the youths of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. Although many had been indoctrinated from a young age, U.S. tribunals did not overlook their brutality. Those whose actions were especially cruel received harsh punishments, including death sentences in some cases. Other trials focused on young people who had worked as guards in concentration camps like Dachau. The courts ruled that anyone who had facilitated the crimes committed in the camps would be held accountable, regardless of age or rank. The severity of these verdicts reflected the magnitude of the crimes and the need to set a clear precedent in international justice. These tribunals took place during the broader context of Germany's reconstruction, where denazification and re-education were critical priorities. The Allies understood that to eradicate Nazism, it was necessary to prosecute the guilty and at the same time understand how a society had allowed its youth to be transformed into obedient executors of a genocidal regime. Although less well known than the Nuremberg trials, the American military tribunals played a crucial role in holding lower-level perpetrators accountable. Their legacy shows that justice was not limited to the architects of the Third Reich, but extended to all those who, regardless of age, participated in the Nazi machinery of destruction. Another significant case involved members of the SS Totenkopfverbände, known as the Death's Head units, who administered the concentration camps. Among them was Josef Clare, a young man influenced by Nazi ideology from an early age. Clare worked as a guard at Auschwitz and directly participated in the gassing and murder of thousands of prisoners. Survivor testimonies during the trials described his lack of remorse and his active role as an executor of genocide. Captured by American forces, Clare was tried in the Dachau trials, which focused on crimes committed in concentration camps. Witness testimonies made it clear that he had played a leading role in the systematic killing of defenseless prisoners. Ultimately, Clare was sentenced to death and executed in 1948. Another young man involved in war crimes was Heinz Georg Linger, who at 21 was a member of the Leibstandarte SS, Hitler's personal guard. Linger was implicated in the execution of deserters and political rivals during the final days of the war in Berlin. Despite his youth, Linger showed unwavering loyalty to the Führer and fervently defended his cause. However, the American military courts tried him as an active agent of Nazism. He was sentenced to death and hanged in 1946. These cases exemplify the fate of many young men who, raised under the totalitarian influence of the Third Reich, became executors of unimaginable crimes. The Allied courts faced the challenge of balancing justice with the acknowledgement of the indoctrination these generations had undergone. While some were treated with leniency, those whose actions showed voluntary cruelty faced the harshest consequences, leaving behind a dark legacy that still resonates in history. Psychological impact on Nazi youth and their defenders. The psychological aftermath of Nazi indoctrination became evident during the post-war trials. Many of the young defendants, members of the Hitler Youth and the SS, displayed confusion and disorientation when confronted with the charges against them. Throughout their lives, they had been taught that their actions were not only right, but a moral duty. Now, the outside world revealed to them that what they had considered heroism was, in fact, murder and cruelty. Trial observers noted signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, among these young defendants. The end of the Nazi regime represented not only a political or military defeat. For them, it was the collapse of a belief system that had shaped their identities. Their inability to reconcile the morality of their actions left them trapped between the duty they had been taught and the reality of their crimes. One of the most striking aspects of the trials was how these young men, shaped since childhood, justified their actions. Blind obedience to the regime, instilled under the guise of patriotism and duty, had turned them into agents devoid of independent moral reasoning. Many repeatedly claimed they were simply following orders, a phrase that became a recurring defense in the courts. Defense attorneys faced complex dilemmas. On the one hand, their clients had taken part in unspeakable atrocities, including mass executions and killings in concentration camps. On the other hand, these young men were products of a system that had stripped them of their ability to distinguish right from wrong. As part of their defense strategy, lawyers presented psychiatric studies and expert testimony demonstrating the ideological indoctrination these youths had undergone from an early age. A representative case was that of Erwin Metz, a former member of the Hitler Youth and SS soldier assigned to Buchenwald concentration camp. Metz participated in the execution of prisoners, but his defense argued that he had been thoroughly indoctrinated and emotionally detached. Experts at the trial stated that his behavior was a clear reflection of the ideological trauma inflicted by the regime. Despite this, Metz was convicted, although his case highlighted the psychological and ethical complexity of prosecuting indoctrinated youth. Another example was Hermann Klemm, a 19-year-old who took part in massacres in occupied Poland. During his trial, his lawyer pointed out that Klemm had been a child when he was recruited and trained to become a killer, arguing that his free will had been suppressed by Nazi indoctrination. This case reopened fundamental questions about the moral and legal responsibility of youths who had been shaped by the regime's ideology since childhood. While public opinion demanded severe punishments, psychologists and ethical thinkers debated whether it was fair to apply the same standards to young people who had been systematically manipulated. The question of where to draw the line between guilt and forced indoctrination remained unanswered. The trials of these young Nazis not only exposed the atrocities they had committed, but also the deep psychological impact the regime had on an entire generation. The destruction of their moral compass, their emotional detachment, and their confusion about the nature of their actions highlight the devastating consequences of propaganda and ideological manipulation. These judicial proceedings remain a stark reminder of how a totalitarian regime can corrupt young and vulnerable minds, raising questions that continue to resonate in the fields of justice and ethics. Reactions of the United States and Germany to the fate of Nazi youth. During the post-war trials, American public opinion overwhelmingly supported a firm prosecution of Nazi war criminals, including members of the Hitler Youth. The Nuremberg trials, widely covered by the media, revealed the full scale of the atrocities committed during the Holocaust and the role that indoctrinated youth had played in the Nazi machinery. Outraged by these horrors, the American people believed that anyone involved in such crimes, regardless of age, should be held accountable. For most Americans, the youth of the Third Reich were a key cog in the Nazi regime, fanatical soldiers ready to fight to the death and commit acts of barbarity. However, within legal and intellectual circles, a debate emerged over the fairness of trying these young people with the same severity as adults. Defense attorneys and human rights advocates argued that these teenagers had been victims of propaganda and indoctrination, tools of a totalitarian state that stripped them of free will. They contended that treating these youths as adult criminals ignored the circumstances under which they were raised. Although valid, these arguments ultimately failed to sway public sentiment. The majority of American society believed the trials were necessary to eradicate all remnants of Nazism and prevent future regimes of a similar nature. From this perspective, any participation in the Nazi regime, regardless of age, had to be punished in the name of justice. In Germany, the reaction to the trials of young Nazis was more complex and polarized. National devastation and the trauma of the Holocaust led much of the population to respond with denial and evasion. For many Germans, especially families with children who had been in the Hitler Youth, these young individuals were seen as victims of a perverse system that had manipulated them from childhood. They argued that these youths had no choice and that their actions were the result of relentless indoctrination. However, another segment of German society, particularly those who had resisted Nazism, supported the trials. They believed justice was essential for Germany to confront its past and to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. The Allies, particularly the United States, faced the challenge of balancing justice with the need for reconstruction. They understood that an excessively harsh policy could breed resentment and hinder Germany's recovery, while too much leniency could foster a lack of accountability and impunity. As a result, the trials focused on distinguishing between youths who had acted under coercion and those who had voluntarily taken part in heinous crimes. The most brutal were met with severe punishments, while others were treated with greater leniency. Over time, public perception of Nazi youth began to shift. In the 1950s, as Germany was rebuilding and entering the stage of the Cold War, attention turned more toward forgiveness and stability. Many young people who had been imprisoned were granted early release, helping to consolidate a more united Europe in the face of the new threat posed by the Soviet bloc. However, in the 1960s, a new generation of Germans began to question the legacy of Nazism and the role of youth in the regime. Debates emerged about collective guilt and the role of historical memory, leading to a critical reassessment of the past. This process of self-examination allowed Germany to rebuild not only its economy, but also its national identity, confronting the shadows of its darkest history. Post-war reflections: were the trials fair? After the end of World War II, the trials of Nazi criminals, including members of the Hitler Youth, were initially seen as necessary and justified acts. The magnitude of the crimes committed, such as the Holocaust and the atrocities of the concentration camps, led the Allied nations to pursue severe and immediate punishment, with a strong resolve to eradicate fascism and prevent similar regimes from rising again. At the time, public opinion, particularly in the Allied countries, supported the executions and imprisonments as a form of retributive justice for the atrocities committed. However, as post-war fervor began to fade, historians and analysts started to question the fairness of these trials, particularly in the case of young Nazis. An ethical dilemma emerged. Could individuals who had been indoctrinated from childhood in a totalitarian ideology be held fully accountable? The Hitler Youth was designed to instill blind obedience to the Nazi regime, molding a generation to serve the Führer without question. Some historians argue that these youths were, in essence, victims of the system, raised in an environment that denied them critical thinking and the ability to independently judge their actions. On the other hand, some held the view that indoctrination was not a sufficient excuse to exempt these young people from responsibility. Their actions, especially when they involved conscious participation in war crimes and atrocities, had to be judged accordingly. This perspective argued that regardless of age or ideological context, each individual must be accountable for their actions. Another significant criticism was the accusation that the trials represented a form of victor's justice. Some scholars pointed out that the Allies, in their pursuit of justice, failed to adequately distinguish between indoctrinated youth and responsible adults. The fact that some of these youths, as young as 17, were executed alongside adult war criminals sparked debate over whether the sentences had been too severe. Over time, analysis of these trials has evolved toward a socio-psychological perspective. Nazi youths, as products of years of propaganda and ideological manipulation, became symbols of the ethical and legal dilemmas that arise under totalitarian systems. Today, many believe that these trials should be interpreted within a broader context that considers the complex and subtle factors that led to these young people's involvement in horrific crimes. While the necessity of the trials and the punishment of perpetrators has never been fully questioned, the approach taken toward Nazi youth continues to spark debate about the nature of justice and guilt. Were these punishments a fair measure or an overreaction driven by the desire for immediate retribution? The answer to this question remains crucial for understanding the ethics of post-war justice and the influence of ideological manipulation in times of conflict. The analysis of the trials of Nazi youth reveals how these proceedings became a key component in understanding post-war justice and its implications for both the United States and Germany. For the United States, the trials established a critical precedent in shaping policies related to military justice and the protection of minors in conflict zones. In Germany, these processes contributed to a profound transformation in the country's culture and legislation, generating a focus on rehabilitation and reconciliation for those involved. The ethical and moral debates that emerged from these trials remain relevant today, raising questions about guilt, responsibility, and ideological manipulation. Beyond their immediate implications, these events laid the groundwork for the development of global justice and modern social systems, serving as a reminder of the lessons humanity cannot afford to forget.